Good morning. We convene this hearing to continue the committee's examination of Department of Energy's management and oversight of its nuclear weapons complex. 3 national weapons laboratories and 5 production and testing facilities. These 8 sites are responsible for the stewardship of our nation's nuclear weapons stockpile. DOE, through its National Nuclear Security Administration, or NNSA, spends billions of dollars each year performing hazardous operations to maintain and secure nuclear weapons and weapons materials. This work is performed by contractors at the Department's nuclear weapons sites under the supervision of federal officials and requires strict adherence to strong safety standards. The supremely sensitive nature of the materials and technologies also requires the Department to ensure an extraordinary level of security to safeguard these nuclear sites and operations. Our attention today will focus mainly on the lessons for the Department from the security and oversight failures that occurred last summer at the Y-12 National Security Complex in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, and what DOE is doing to address these lessons. At its hearing this past September, the subcommittee began to examine preliminary information about the failures at Y-12. We learned how these failures allowed 3 protesters at around 4:20 a.m. one morning last July to penetrate security fences and detection systems and deface the walls of the facility storing highly enriched uranium. We learned about maintenance problems and compensatory security measures to work around broken equipment and chronic false alarms. We learned about the inadequate response by the protective guard force. And most to the point of our hearing today, we learned about the failure of contractor governance and federal oversight to identify and correct the multiple early indicators of Y-12 security, maintenance, and communication systems breakdowns. The DOE Inspector General's testimony at that hearing revealed that federal site officials did not do anything to address security maintenance backlogs because NNSA's contractor governance system meant, quote, they could no longer intervene, unquote. This, perhaps, is the most incomprehensible aspect of this troubling situation. It appears that due to a hands-off federal contracting policy, we had ineffective federal security oversight at Y-12 and potentially at other sites around the complex. Information produced since September confirms that a strong oversight approach to security has not been paramount at DOE, particularly since the Department instituted certain reforms to its oversight in 2009 and 2010. The stated purpose of these reforms was to give contractors flexibility to tailor and implement safety and security programs without excessive federal oversight or overly prescriptive departmental requirements. Whatever the intent, the reforms in practice were interpreted by federal site officials to mean they couldn't intervene when security problems arose. We will discuss today the findings of a revealing task force assessment, which was commissioned in response to Y-12 and released to the Administrator in November. Led by Air Force Brigadier General Sandra Finnan, who will testify on the first panel this morning, the task force found that issues at Y-12 were part of a larger pattern of deficiencies in NNSA's security-related functions and activities across the board. Notably, the task force found no clear lines of accountability at NNSA and broken security policy processes and eyes-on, hands-off governance approach that weakened federal oversight and federal organizations, quote, incapable of performing effective security performance assessment, unquote, of the contractors operating the sites. We will hear testimony from GAO on our second panel that many of these deficiencies are identical to those identified at NNSA 10 years ago. It appears the Department instituted reforms that actually may have exacerbated the deficiencies, turning eyes on, hands off to eyes closed, hands off. Deputy Secretary Poneman and Acting NNSA Administrator Miller, I trust, will explain to us today how and when the agency will implement the task force's recommendations and exactly how they will communicate clear and appropriate priorities for safety and security in their governance of the sites. Let me welcome you both, and General Finnan. Our second panel provides broader perspective on security culture at the Department. Along with GAO, we will hear from General Donald Alston and former NRC Chairman Richard Meser, 2 of the 3 contributors to an analysis requested by the Secretary of Energy about the physical security structures at the DOE. The experiences and perspectives of these witnesses should help us to put the security deficiencies in the broader context of the oversight and management challenges confronting DOE. At the end, we should identify a path forward for the Department to ensure strong oversight and zero tolerance for failures. The risks to millions of people, and indeed geopolitics, are too important for anything less. I'd now like to recognize Ranking Member Diana DeGette for her opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, as you said, a little over 7 months ago, an 82-year-old nun and 2 middle-aged men breached the security perimeter surrounding the highly enriched uranium facility at the Y-12 National Security Complex in Oak Ridge, Tennessee. In the wake of that incident, this committee had a hearing to learn exactly how such an absurd and dangerous breach of security could happen. Today, I want to thank you for having this follow-up hearing to learn what has happened to address the security breakdowns that resulted in the breach and to make sure that something like that never happens again. I want to thank you, Mr. Chairman, for continuing our long-standing bipartisan interest in this subcommittee in ensuring that our nuclear facilities are safe and secure. Our past oversight over the nuclear complex has made a significant difference, raising standards for worker safety, ensuring lab safety, ensuring security standards remain accountable to those who work within the labs and who live nearby, and forcing NNSA to make significant changes when things go awry. But I've got to tell you, as I've told you before, both on and off the record, every few years we go through this same thing. There's an incident. There's an aggressive response from NNSA. Time passes without an incident, and everybody begins to relax. Labs start to complain about overly burdensome paperwork and oversight. In response, expectations and rules are relaxed. And then, of course, without fail, another incident occurs. I'm tired of this pattern, and we should all be tired of this pattern because it really does affect our national security. Today, I'm hoping to hear how NNSA and DOE have responded to last year's call to action, not just at Y-12, but across the NNSA complex. But more importantly, I want to hear what they're doing to ensure that we don't have to have any more hearings about security breaches or safety incidents at these sites. I guess my view is it's time to break this pattern. I want to commend the agencies for acting promptly to address the issues exposed at Y-12 in the wake of the July 28th breach. However, I continue to be deeply concerned about oversight within NNSA. Last month, GAO again released its high-risk list identifying agencies and program areas that are at high risk due to their vulnerabilities to fraud, waste, abuse, and mismanagement. Just as it has been since 1990, contract management at NNSA is on this list. Assessments conducted after last year's security breach show that NNSA's dubious honor is well deserved. A February 2013 DOE Inspector General report described a, quote, eyes-on, hands-off approach to contractor oversight, meaning federal employees felt they could monitor but not intervene in contractor activities, even if they suspected an issue. Recent assessments conducted by DOE's Office of Health, Safety, and Security showed contractor communication problems both between different contractors at the Y-12 site and between the contractor and federal employees at Y-12. And other independent experts observed a Y-12 culture that completely failed to adequately focus on security. As terror threats become more real and as our enemies become more sophisticated, we just can't afford to take this eyes-on, hands-off approach to security. Tens of thousands of people work at these labs and facilities, and we owe it to them and to the communities around the facilities and the American people to ensure that they're safe and secure. To do that, we've got to closely examine and monitor the nuclear complex, promote transparency when it comes to how DOE and NNSA are using their resources, and demand accountability from everybody involved. We have to insist that standards are simply never relaxed because people don't like filling out paperwork. In short, we have to demand more. There's been no shortage of assessments of what should be done for the complex, and in the coming months, I'm sure we can expect more of these. As we move forward, we have to continue to make sure that DOE and NNSA are keeping nuclear safe sites safe and adapting and responding to the ever-changing security challenges at the nuclear complex. So, Mr. Chairman, I'm happy that you are continuing the grand tradition of this subcommittee in oversight of DOE and NNSA, and I look forward to working with you as we move along in the future. I yield back.
I thank the Congresswoman from Colorado. Now I recognize the Chairman of the full committee, Mr. Upton, for an opening statement.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Today's hearing represents another important step in this committee's ongoing oversight to ensure that the Department of Energy's management of nuclear security enterprise can successfully protect taxpayer dollars, ensure public health and worker safety, and in fact safeguard our national security assets. We know from our past work, as well as from the recent and very troubling security failures at Y-12, that management reform is necessary to ensure safe and secure operations. The challenge has been learning the right lessons from past failures and then successfully implementing the right fixes. Time and again, over the last 14 years, we've witnessed dramatic failures in safety and security, as well as taxpayer waste across the nuclear complex. Despite that poor track record, in 2009, DOE proposed increased autonomy and less oversight as the appropriate corrective actions. We know, though, from past experiences in the Y-12 breach that strong and consistent federal management, bolstered by truly independent oversight, is in fact necessary. DOE leadership must be clear that safety and security come first. They go hand in hand. This is the lesson that we've learned from the civilian nuclear industry. As safety improves, so does performance. Absent an embedded safety culture, there is erosion of safety practices leading to outages, delays, and other operational impacts. The same is true for security. The Y-12 security breach demonstrated not only a failure at the site, but also a failure of DOE and NNSA management. We can trace some of that failure to the initiatives launched by DOE leadership 3 and 4 years ago to rely more on contractor self-assessments and define success as productivity gains. Secretary Chu himself wanted DOE to be viewed as a partner and asset, his words, for the contractors, sending the signal that oversight of these contractors would not be a priority. Members on this committee warned the Secretary in 2010 that such initiatives, however well-intentioned, were misinterpreting the lessons of the past and could in fact backfire. And that track record speaks for itself. As this committee, with oversight responsibility for DOE, we must ensure that current and future DOE leadership learns the right lessons. That starts today when we hear about the plans to fix and sustain improvements in safety and security oversight. I yield the balance of my time to Dr. Burgess.
I thank the chairman, the full committee chairman of the subcommittee for calling this important hearing. This is an important follow-up on the committee's work in the last Congress into the astonishing security lapses that occurred at one of our most important and reportedly most secure nuclear weapons facilities in the country. You know, you look at the continuum, the range of failure, and it goes from totally unacceptable to an abject failure, and this is at one of our country's most important facilities that stores highly enriched uranium for our defenses and for our national security. At last September's hearing, I voiced my concern over the lack of accountability. We need to know who at Department of Energy was held accountable, who lost their job, because of this epic failure of security and oversight. Now, General Finnan's task force, I think, has put it very succinctly that there's a pervasive culture of tolerating the intolerable and accepting the unacceptable. I fear that statement has really become the operational motto of the executive branch, where failure after failure is met with a shrug and not much more. Had this incident been perpetrated by someone with more sinister motives, the break-in could have had catastrophic results for that region and for our nation. So I continue to be concerned that our security at our nation's most critical facilities is not being given the priority that it deserves. Chairman Murphy and I met with General Finnan, and I thank you, General, for taking the time for that meeting. This was a month ago to discuss some of the observation that her task force has made in the security lapses and the oversight failures at NNSA. So certainly we look forward to hearing from you this morning as to where the NNSA stands in its oversight of these facilities. This investigation is a prime example of the good work that this committee can do when it works in a bipartisan manner. The security of our nation's weapons facilities is not an issue that divides or should divide along party lines. We are all in favor of safe, secure areas where our nuclear stockpiles can be held, ready to protect our nation and safe from predators. With that, Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back.
Thank the gentleman. Now recognize for 5 minutes the Ranking Member of the full committee, Mr. Waxman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for recognizing me and for holding this hearing. The Y-12 incident was embarrassing for DOE and NNSA, the National Nuclear Security Administration. It exposed serious issues within the security organization at NNSA. I appreciate our witnesses being here today, and I hope they'll help us identify and address these concerns. The security concerns we will hear about today must be addressed. We cannot let our nuclear facilities become targets for our foreign enemies and terrorists. We need to invest in the safety and security of these facilities, both financially and by ensuring they have a culture that's focused on keeping our nuclear legacy materials and the people who work with them safe and secure. I appreciate DOE's actions in the wake of the Y-12 incident. The department has taken this incident seriously, developed a thoughtful approach to addressing concerns that have been identified, but there's still more work left to be done. DOE needs to ensure that it exercises strong oversight over both its contractors and its federal employees at NNSA sites. And as noted by General Finnan today, DOE needs to ensure that there is a clear line of authority from the Secretary down to the contractor security guards at every site. Over the years, many people have advocated many different structures for NNSA, but the assessments made after the Y-12 incident show that the problem is not too much DOE oversight, it's too little. The problem is that contractors didn't take their responsibilities to the government or their workers seriously, that federal employees failed to exercise appropriate authority over their contractor counterparts, and that NNSA's culture didn't adequately focus on security. These problems can be resolved by effective oversight by DOE, by requiring that contractors become accountable and transparent, and by ensuring that the federal officials who oversee these contractors take a hands-on approach to oversight. In the past year, some have suggested that NNSA needs more autonomy. In fact, last year's House-passed National Defense Authorization Act included language stripping DOE's authority over some NNSA sites. Given what we've seen in the last 7 months, that approach makes absolutely no sense. The Y-12 breach made it abundantly clear that NNSA is not doing enough on its own. All the findings and recommendations that have come from independent evaluators of the Y-12 breach, including NNSA's own task force, show that NNSA needs more oversight, not less. NNSA sites house some of our most dangerous nuclear assets. We need vigorous oversight by DOE to ensure that these nuclear materials are appropriately protected. Mr. Chairman, again, thank you for holding this hearing. I look forward to more opportunities to check in on NNSA's progress. Yield back the balance of my time.
I thank you. The gentleman yields back. And now we'll go over our witnesses today. With us today is Brigadier General, United States Air Force, Sandra Finnan. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. I believe I am, right? Thank you for being here. The Commander of Air Force Nuclear Weapons Center and former Acting Chief of Defense Nuclear Security, National Nuclear Security Administration. Also joining her is Daniel B. Poneman, the Deputy Secretary, U.S. Department of Energy. Thank you so much for being with us today, sir. And also accompanied by Neil Miller, the Acting Administrator of NNSA. Hope I have all the titles correct. As you know, the testimony you're about to give is subject to Title 18, Section 1001 of the United States Code. When holding an investigative hearing, this committee has a practice of taking testimony under oath. Do you have any objections to testifying under oath? No, you do. The chair then advises you that under the rules of the House and rules of the committee, you are entitled to be advised by counsel. Do you desire to be advised by counsel during your testimony today? They all say no. Then, in that case, if you would please rise and raise your right hand, and I'll swear you in. Do you swear that the testimony you're about to give is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? Thank you. Noting for the record that all the witnesses have responded in the affirmative, Now call upon each of them to give a 5-minute summary and a written statement, starting off with you, General Finnan. Thank you for being here today.
Chairman Murphy, Ranking Member DeGette, distinguished members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to discuss the study I conducted on the National Nuclear Security Administration's Federal Security Organization.
Now, could you pull your mic closer to yourself there, if it's on, too?
Sure. Is that better?
Yes,
yeah.
much better.
Okay,
Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you for the opportunity to discuss the study I conducted on the National Nuclear Security Administration's Federal Security Organization and Assessment Model. Although I am no longer assigned to the NNSA, I am pleased to share our observations based on our 90-day study. In the aftermath of the July 28, 2012 security incident at the National Nuclear Security Administration's Y-12 National Security Complex, the leadership of the NNSA and the Department of Energy took action to address the security failures at Y-12. The initial information gathered revealed that the issues at Y-12 were part of a larger pattern of security program management deficiencies within NNSA. These security issues prompted the NNSA administrator to commission a task force to analyze the current federal NNSA security organizational structure and security oversight model and recommend possible improvements. The NNSA administrator directed the task force to analyze the current NNSA security organizational structure and recommend possible improvements, and to analyze the current NNSA security oversight model and mechanisms to determine what seams existed and what structures could be implemented to better ensure that issues are found and fixed before they become problems. While other reviews were aimed at diagnosing the root causes of the Y-12 event, the NNSA administrator's direction called for this task force to focus on a path forward within the federal NNSA organization. Under my leadership, the task force, consisting of NNSA, DOE, and military specialists, conducted extensive document reviews and interviewed federal managers and staff, as well as a selection of contractor security managers and others across the NNSA security organization. The task force collected and analyzed information, identified issues, and suggested a revised organizational structure and assessment model. While we highlighted negative aspects of the NNSA security organization and assessment model, the task force found many great people on the NNSA security staffs. They are clearly dedicated, skilled, and hardworking, and want to get the security mission done right. Unfortunately, NNSA security personnel have seen themselves thwarted by lack of management support and feel obstructed by some of their peers. Their difficulties were compounded by the absence of a workforce strategy to recruit, retain, and develop a cadre of talented, knowledgeable, and experienced security professionals. Thus, it is all the more encouraging that these personnel, almost without exception, generally care about doing good work. Their continued strong desire to build a successful security organization is a hopeful sign for the future. Mr. Chairman, with your permission, I'll submit the remainder of my testimony for the record. It contains the findings of the task force.
Thank you, John. Appreciate it. Mr. Poneman.
Chairman Murphy, Ranking Member DeGette, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the invitation to appear before you today to provide the subcommittee details on the actions the Department has taken or will take to strengthen the security of the nuclear weapons complex in the wake of the July 2012 Y-12 incident. We appreciate the interest and engagement of this committee and recognize the important oversight role that you fulfill. The Secretary and I recognize the severity of the problem that led us to this point, and we have acted swiftly to identify and address the issues it revealed. Since the Y-12 incursion, several major actions have taken place to improve security immediately and for the long term. Let me tell you about a few of them. We restructured the contracts at Y-12 to integrate security into the line of command of the M&O contractor. The protective force contractor was terminated, and a new M&O contractor has been selected to manage the Y-12 site, providing an opportunity for new leadership and to improve the Y-12 security culture. We held accountable both the senior federal and contractor management personnel at headquarters and the site, removing them from their positions. The Department's Chief of Health, Safety, and Security conducted an independent security inspection of Y-12 security operations, which included rigorous force-on-force performance testing, as well as no-notice and short-notice limited-scope performance testing activities as directed by the Secretary. HSS will be conducting a follow-up review in April to examine the status of implementation of corrective actions. The Secretary also directed HSS to conduct immediate extent of condition assessments of all sites containing Category 1 nuclear materials across the DOE complex to identify any immediate security issues and to follow up with full security inspections, including force-on-force exercises, to assure effective security measures are being implemented at those sites. NNSA conducted an immediate after-action report to identify causes, issues to be addressed, and recommended actions. And you've just heard very eloquently summarized the findings of those reports. In order to address these institutional problems that have been revealed, we are continuing to embrace and implement the findings of General Finn's report, which you've just heard her describe. Because we believe that we need fresh perspectives from disinterested party to consider broader and long-term responses to this incident, Secretary Chu requested 3 independent experts in this area to conduct a strategic review of the entire DOE security architecture with a particular emphasis on Y-12. And I see that you are joined by 2 of the 3 of these eminent experts here today. Each of them provided thoughtful advice on the DOE's nuclear security structure, specifically all Category 1 nuclear facilities. We are now reviewing and discussing their advice on how to improve security at Y-12 and across the nuclear enterprise. The series of personnel and management changes I have described today were made to provide effective security at the Y-12 site and across the DOE complex. We are also working to carry out the structural and cultural changes required to secure all Category 1 nuclear materials at this and all other DOE and NNSA facilities. And in this respect, I welcome the comments in your opening remarks from members of this subcommittee about the need to induce cultural changes so that we're not back in the same situation again. That's absolutely critical. And I think as we get into the discussion, what you hear in terms of what we're implementing from General Finn's report will put us in the right direction in that respect. Our management principles hold that our mission is vital and urgent. Nowhere is that more true than here. The security of our nation's nuclear material and technology is a core responsibility of the Department in support of the President and in defense of the nation. The incident at Y-12 was unacceptable and served as an important wake-up call for our entire complex. The Department is taking aggressive actions to ensure the reliability of our nuclear security programs across the entire DOE enterprise and will continue to do so. In that effort, the Department looks forward to working with this subcommittee to ensure the security of the nation's nuclear materials. I would be pleased, of course, to answer any questions from members of this subcommittee and request the balance of my statement be submitted for the record. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And
so ordered. The balance of your statement will be submitted for the record. We understand, Ms. Miller, you do not have an opening statement, so we'll go right into some questions. I'll recognize myself for 5 minutes. First of all, let me just say that I appreciate your candor. Nothing is better for leaders than to step forward and say mistakes have been made, taking full responsibility, and taking definitive action. I thank you for that. We're certainly hoping this never happens again, and we hope that the report and recommendations are going to be fully implemented and continue to be reviewed. So let me start off with you, General Finn. Your task force identified these serious weaknesses in the federal capability to evaluate contractor performance at the nuclear weapons complex. The NNSA Administrator commissioned your report. Am I correct in that?
Yes, sir.
It is also correct that the recommendations are directed at the Administrator, not the Secretary of Energy. Am I correct?
That is correct. It was all NNSA focused.
Thank you. Just want to make sure we're following the right chain here. Mr. Poneman, as Deputy Secretary of Energy, you and the Secretary set high-level policy direction and safety and security standards for NNSA's mission, but it is the responsibility of the NNSA to arrange its structure to accomplish these goals. That is up to the Administrator. Am I correct?
It is up to the Administrator, of course, subject to, as you just said, the leadership of the Secretary and the Deputy Secretary.
And something you'll continue to monitor as well.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Ms. Miller, you're now the NNSA Acting Administrator.
That's correct.
Is it correct that you were Principal Deputy Administrator at NNSA as it implemented its safety and security reform efforts in 2010?
I became the Principal Deputy Administrator in August of 2010.
Okay. Do you agree with the findings of General Finn's report?
I completely agree with them.
Thank you. And General Finnan states that NNSA must clearly and consistently emphasize the importance of security. Do you agree with her statement?
I absolutely agree with that.
Thank you. Do you believe that NNSA's leadership has been inconsistent in the message it sends to the field about security emphasis?
I believe it's been inconsistently communicated. Yes, absolutely.
Were you aware of the inconsistent messages on security prior to Y-12?
I would say that I was aware that because the Chief of Defense Nuclear Security, as well as the Chief of Defense Nuclear Safety, reported directly to the administrator and not to me, I would say I was aware of the difficulty and the inconsistencies in communicating policy and decisions through security and many other areas from the headquarters organization to the field offices.
Let me ask this, since part of the purpose of this Committee on Oversight is to make sure that we are understanding lessons learned, but what you don't measure, you can't manage. What you don't admit, you can't act on. Were there some lessons you learned from this and things that you should do differently in terms of the process as we move forward?
Mr. Chairman, I would say two things. First of all, there were lessons I had been learning prior to this incident that caused us to announce a few weeks before this incident at the end of July, caused us to announce that we were changing the way we governed our sites. And that is to say, we took the sites from within defense programs, our large weapons program, where they had been reporting for a number of years, and had them now directly report to the administrator through an associate administrator, peer level with the senior management, so that we could start to drive accountability and consistency across our sites. So that was a measure that I had come to the conclusion the organization absolutely had to make to address what I said before, which was concern about inconsistencies all over the place. With regard to post Y-12 incident, in particular with security, I was fortunate to be able to draw upon General Finnan's recommendations and work with her, as she was part of the organization at the time, and others to change the way we operate security both at headquarters and in the field.
Thank you. Last month on February 5th at NNSA, Associate Administrator for Management and Budget disputed the Inspector General's report that Y-12 oversight was ineffective because of the eyes-on, hands-off oversight approach. The official said that the eyes-on, hands-off policy never applied to security matters and that this was a misperception by some federal officials. Ms. Miller, why is an NNSA senior official continuing to dispute the impact of the eyes-on, hands-off policy?
I think the issue is not to dispute the impact. I think the point is that we certainly did not set out, and again, this predates me, but no one set out to say that oversight should not be conducted, that your proper role is not to be overseeing all aspects of the contractor's performance. What I would say is that, as you yourself mentioned, driving that message through a very large organization, from the administrator through every individual in every layer at every site, is the big challenge. It's the challenge in security. It's the challenge all over the place. It's not a new issue, as the ranking member mentioned. We need to break the pattern, and that's definitely what the organization is about right now.
Well, thank you. Hopefully you communicate it through solidly because of the extreme concerns about what happened. Yeah. I'll recognize each member 5 minutes to go through. Next is Ms. DeGette.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Poneman, I was intrigued when, first of all, let me say I am impressed and encouraged by the commitment the agency has made to not having to come back here next year or the year after with some new crisis. And both in these hearings and also in some of our side conversations, I do believe you have that commitment. Secretary Poneman, I wanted to ask you, because you just said in your testimony that you're committed to implementing some of the aspects of the General's report to make sure we're not back here in a year or two. Wondering if you can briefly tell us, if you can give us the highlights of what those things are.
Gladly, Congresswoman DeGette. The critical, I think, finding that General Finnan's report showed was that we had a lack of clarity of line of management, control, and accountability. So what we have done is, under her recommendation, implemented by Acting Administrator Miller, and fortunately, before General Finnan left us, she was the acting head of Defense Nuclear Security to get this started. We have now made sure that under this organization that Ms. Miller just introduced of the operations and infrastructure, that the responsibility to direct security at the site flows down from the administrator through that office to the site. The other office that had been doing security policy, so-called NA-70, had been actually exercising some apparent line management authority, which was creating confusion. That function has been stripped away. Any line authority has been stripped away from NA-70.
So you think that's the key, having a clear chain of that's the number one.
Number one.
What else?
Number two is the staff function that new organization, the NA-70, must perform. They need to promulgate the policies and perform independent evaluations, so it's not just the site checking itself.
Okay, so independent evaluations, those are the two key things that are happening.
Oversight and the line management.
Now, another issue, we might do another round, but so I want to just go into this other issue that I care a lot about, which is complaints that the committee has heard about overly burdensome oversight stifling the work being done at NNSA labs and sites. And what we think, I was talking to the chairman about this, is that federal officials need to conduct strict oversight of the contractors, or serious security problems can fall through the cracks. So what I wanted to ask you, General Finnan, in your review, did you find that the problems you saw within NNSA were caused by overly burdensome congressional oversight?
The issues that I found were not caused at all by oversight. It was actually caused by lack of oversight, and I mean oversight at every level.
Right, right.
It was
so what we need to have
NNSA, everything.
We need to have clear oversight from the top down, and as Mr. Poneman says, independent oversight.
Right. The burden was actually we created a system that required a whole bunch of paperwork, and the paperwork is burdensome. But what we lost in security was the ability to see security performance.
Right.
There was paperwork.
Yeah, there was a bunch of paperwork, but it was irrelevant to the core task, right?
Correct.
Mr. Poneman, you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I thought it was a very apt finding, and the misinterpretation of that 2010 reform is exactly on this point. We were trying to strip away the excessive paperwork and get to the performance testing.
But did any of the audits or assessments conducted in the wake of the Y-12 incident find that it was caused by too much congressional oversight of the Y-12 contractors?
No, ma'am.
Okay. And the reason I bring this up is because some people try to say, oh, we have too much oversight. It seems to me when we have these problems over and over again, the problem's not too much oversight. The problem is too little effective oversight and accountability. Ms. Miller, you're nodding your head. Would you agree with that?
Yes, I would definitely agree with about effectiveness.
Now, let's see. General Finnan, can you tell us about the findings of the task force with respect to improved oversight of NNSA security contractors? You touched on it just very briefly.
Right. The recommendation we're making is that we create a NNSA oversight assessment function, because right now in the system, as I looked at it a couple months ago, NNSA did not have any oversight capability. They depended on on-site federal personnel to analyze contractor performance. But again, they were applying the eyes-on, hands-off concept, and so that was varied from site to site. And what happened is that you lacked, there was no sense of criticism in this assessment. Right? You had on-site people who were your really only federal ability to look at contractor performance. Well, those folks on site grew up there, they lived there, they spent their whole time, they identified with the mission, and they were really not a very good source of independent oversight as to contractor performance.
Thank you. And Mr. Poneman and Ms. Miller, do you agree with that?
Absolutely.
Yes.
And the reforms we've described, I think, reflect that finding.
Thank you. Ms. Miller, do you agree with that?
I do.
Thank you.
Thank you. Gentlelady yields back and now recognize the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Johnson, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Poneman, in her testimony, General Finnan states that NNSA must clearly and consistently emphasize the importance of security. Unfortunately, here is the consistent message that the DOE, NNSA organizations, and contractors were hearing. In March of 2010, Secretary Chu stated his vision that he wanted DOE to be viewed as a valued partner and asset to contractors. He went on to suggest that safety could be ensured with a skeleton crew of health and safety experts. Also in March of 2010, Mr. Poneman, you wrote in the department's Safety and Security Reform Plan that Success will be measured through near-term relief from specific low-value, burdensome requirements, as well as longer-term streamlining of requirements that will lead to measurable productivity improvements. I note that safety and security did not factor into this definition of success. Would you agree that statements like these send mixed signals about the Department's commitment to safety?
Congressman, the portion of the document read from my document, that the genesis of that was to set out a set of safety and security objectives. So in fact, that particular sentence is out of documents that are precisely intended to maximize safety and security. What is unfortunate, what has happened is the misinterpretation of that. What we were trying to do, sir, was to get rid of the checkbox mentality of just looking at paperwork and creating paperwork, get back to performance testing so we could be better, safer, and more secure. That's absolutely our objective.
Okay. What are you doing today to ensure consistent and clear emphasis on safety importance from the headquarters on down?
Number one, we are on both safety and security assimilating all of the learnings from reports such as General Finnan's. Number two, because we have found safety culture issues as well as security culture issues, we have regular meetings where we assemble the top leadership in the department to check on a continuing basis that this is being messaged consistently throughout the complex. One of the major challenges, Congressman, that we have found is, as you heard with this talk about eyes on, hands off, the misinterpretation like a kid's game of telephone is a terrible problem. So it's not enough to promulgate a good policy. You've got to continually stay on it, message it, and work with your leadership and work with the people in the field.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Miller, a week or so before the Y-12 incident in July of 2012, Mr. Don Cook, NNSA Deputy Administrator for Defense Programs, made the following remarks, and I quote, "With regard to the relationship that we have and where we are between NNSA and its labs and plants, I didn't say my labs and plants, but you can tell I feel that way, getting to the point where we have oversight of these, which is eyes-on, hands-off oversight, has been my aspiration for several years, and it remains so. It was my aspiration when I worked on the lab side for many years. General Finnan concluded that ensuring that the right leadership is in the right position is absolutely critical to success. What are you going to do to make that happen, ensure that leadership is sending the right message about the importance of safety and security?"
Mr. Johnson, sending the right message, in my view, and after many years of looking at the NNSA, mostly from outside of it, is a challenge that is not achieved just by making sure that people at the top level know what the message means. But it's it's difficult to make sure that every single person in the 10,000 people at a given lab or 30,000 throughout our complex understand what we're talking about. If what we are doing in NNSA is working to be able to communicate and train and talk to people at every single level to make sure it's not going to be misunderstood. We recently changed all of our M&O contracts. The performance measures in those contracts are now all connected to safety and security, so that it's not possible to believe that you have performed according to the terms of the contract in an area like nuclear weapons if you have not also met the performance plans for safety and security. It just isn't going to happen. So this is a step-by-step throughout the organization. It's not just at the top level.
Okay, good. One final question. General Finnan, first of all, as a 26-and-a-half-year veteran of the Air Force myself, thank you for your service and for what you've done here. A troubling finding in your report is that potentially critical management information is not being reported clearly to the appropriate decision makers. Would you elaborate on what you mean by this?
Yes, sir. As we interviewed people and took a look at what was happening, we found that at the lower levels, there were people who knew what issues existed out there and knew the significance of those issues. But as they attempted to rise those issues up to senior levels, they were being suppressed. Management at mid-levels would suppress it. And so in many cases, critical decision information was not making its way to the top of the organization.
Okay, well, thank you for that. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back. Thank
Thank
you.
you. Gentleman's time has expired. Now recognize Mr. Tonko for 5 minutes. Ms. Eden. There you go.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. General Finnan, you state in your testimony that the findings of this task force were very similar to those numerous prior reports by other review teams. So my question is, what happened to the recommendations of prior review teams? Were they ever implemented? Was the implementation insufficient? Or is there a larger problem that still needs to be identified?
There is a cultural issue. Those findings, as you look at them and you go back to see what people did, you'll find that there are some actions that were put in place, but there was a check-the-box mentality that said we want to get rid of the findings as fast as we can. So they do whatever they could to say, yes, I've responded to this finding and it's gone. And so there was the things that they changed didn't stick. It was just a matter of taking action, checking the box, closing the finding, and going on to the next thing. And so what needs to happen is all those things need to be taken in aggregate. We need to create a roadmap, and then we need to change the culture so that we continuously evaluate those things and go back and make sure that we don't, year after year, make the same mistake, and that we're not interested in checking the box off. We're interested in changing the way we do business so we do it the right way.
Thank you. And there seems to be a theme that runs through a number of the task force's observations that cost control was a bigger concern for many of the people managing the program, the security program, than performance of the security mission. This implies there's a real or perceived lack of resources to support the security mission fully. Which is it? Is it real or perceived?
It is a combination of both. What happened was that management had overwhelmingly started to figure out, they wanted to reduce the cost of security. And so in doing that, what they did is they lost sight of the requirements of security. And because the two were mixed together, the people who determined the requirements and the budget were the same people, what happened was that they were no longer looking at the actual requirements for security. They lost sight of what was required in order to adequately secure these materials and these sites. And moreover, they lost visibility on the important aspect of protecting our operational capability and our people. And those items actually got no visibility at all and were completely ignored. They thought that if they could do the big war, if they could fight the terrorists, they could do all the lesser includeds. Therefore, they never needed to look at lesser includeds. Well, lesser includeds happened to be a protest event, and Y-12 proved that lesser includeds you cannot do lesser included just because you can fight the larger issues. So it was a combination of wanting to reduce the budget, which is a good thing. We ought to always be efficient. Mm-hmm. But when you lose sight of the requirements, what happened is senior leaders at NNSA did not get to make the decision. Do I want to fund that requirement, or do I want to take the risk? The risk was being assumed at lower levels by default rather than being made at the senior decision-maker level at NNSA.
Deputy Secretary Poneman, and I thank you for that answer, but Deputy Secretary, how much of DOE's budget is spent on contractors, your area of the budget?
The vast majority, I think it's well over 80%, and we can get you a precise number. I think it's on the order of 85%.
With that amount, the agency then, is it fair to say, is relying on private contractors to implement many key security and safety goals?
Yes, Congressman, going back to the origins of the department back to shortly after World War II, Atomic Energy Commission, this whole model of the so-called management and operating contractor, the M&O contractor model, puts most of the programmatic and security burdens on in the hands of contractors who are exercising that authority under federal oversight.
So do the contractors then have a conflicting bit of incentives here when carrying out their duties?
There is a risk, Congressman, and in that respect, again, one of the many fine findings of General Finnan's report, I think, shows the way we need to address that is the contractor must own and take responsibility for security, and in the first instance must evaluate that under their own self-analysis. But that then needs to have a double check, first from the headquarters, so there's not the on-site cozy relationship, so there's some distance and the federal oversight is effective. And secondly, from an independent organization, the HSS organization, to effectively ensure you have a disinterested third-party look to make sure that that security is being well executed and there are not conflicts of interest, and to hold the contractor accountable if they do not self-disclose problems in security that they, in fact, find in their own forces.
In general opinion, is it possible that contractor concerns over cutting costs could have been one of the causes of the Y-12 incident at Oak Ridge?
It could have been, and it may have been that they had cut back some of their maintenance personnel in order to cut costs and therefore had misprioritized actions. So it could be a contributing factor.
Yeah. Thank you. With that, I
Gentlemen,
go back.
Thank you very much. Chair recognizes the Chairman Emeritus of the Committee from Texas, Mr. Barton.
Thank you. Thank you, and I appreciate the courtesy of letting me ask questions out of order since I wasn't here at the beginning. I appreciate that of my junior members. I want to refresh the subcommittee's memory a little bit. We have had repeated security incidences at the weapons complexes and the national laboratories over the last 20 years. We've had tapes lost. We've had materials lost. This latest incident, which has been sanitized, called the Y-12 incident, 3 nuns, I think, one fairly elderly, penetrated to the deepest security of our weapons complex. Nuns. Okay? Nuns. And they showed up at one of our hearings, and they were in the audience, and these were not ninja warrior, flat-bellied, skulking people. These were just ordinary folks who wandered in, so to speak. So we have, once again, another task force that's going to try to rectify the problems. Now, I want to get the players straight. General Finnan, you're not in the normal chain of command at the Department of Energy. Is that correct?
I am no longer assigned to the Department of Energy. I'm back in the Air Force. Well, I was always in the Air Force, but...
This report that you've helped to prepare was done at the request of DOE, at the request of the then administrator, but you were kind of an outside, fresh-look person. Is that...
Well, I guess I'd call myself an inside outsider. By that time, I had been assigned to NNSA for 18 months, but I was always an Air Force asset. My reporting chain runs through the Air Force. I was always an Air Force member, but I was assigned to NNSA for 2 years. Okay,
now the report that you've testified on has been presented to the Department of Energy. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Okay, now I want to go to Deputy Secretary Pondman. It used to be the Deputy Secretary is the #2 person at DOE. Is that still the case?
Yes, sir.
Are you the Chief Operational Officer at DOE?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So you've read the report?
Yes, sir.
It's been prepared. I've read a summary of it. It's fairly damning, but it's pretty clear-cut in its recommendations. So the bottom line question is, what are you going to do about it? Are you going to accept the recommendations and act on them, or are we going to pontificate and fiddle-faddle around and not do anything?
No, yes, sir. It is a fine report. It's excellent. It's insightful. We embrace it. And not only have we already accepted and put into practice the recommendations, but while we still had the benefit of General Finnan's service in the department, we made her acting Chief of Defense Nuclear Security to oversee the beginnings of the implementation.
So she gets to implement the recommendations.
She had that start, and she's, as she just indicated, been reassigned, and we're carrying forward from that.
One of the recommendations is that you eliminate this multiple diverse authority. Is that going to be done, centralized into one line of authority? That's one of the primary.
That, sir, already has been done, and the further clarification of the role of the other security organization is also underway. We are, as was indicated, also taking into account more widely the recommendations from what we call the 3 wise experts about from whom you'll hear directly, but the parts that you've heard from General Finnan we are already putting into effect.
Okay, now this concept of eyes-on, hands-off oversight, there seems to be some misunderstanding about that. I don't see how that would work anyway.
I don't either, and I think it's a terrible thing that anyone ever thought that that made sense or was the policy of the department. It's absolutely the wrong way to think about it.
So we can assume, since you're the number 2 person, that whatever that concept was, it's no longer in use. It's gone.
Yeah, we have tried, and we will continue, because you can't repeat these messages often enough, to be very, very clear that the federal oversight is critical, and it needs to be active and performance-based, and it cannot be eyes on, hands off. That would never work.
Okay. Now, my final question: can you assure the committee that the actual security of the weapons complex is a first-degree primary function and is not subject to cost issues? I mean, we want these facilities and the materials and the people that are operating within those facilities to be secure, period, and not secondary to the cost of maintaining the security.
Let me be very clear, Congressman. There is nothing more important than the safety and the security of the complex. That's our top priority. We will always, as you would expect, make sure that we are good stewards of the taxpayer resources and not waste money. I don't think that's the implication of your question, but we will always make sure that we never compromise security for any other derivative objective, and the security of that material is paramount.
Well, thank you. And thank you, Mr. Chairman, and the other members. I yield back. I would love to have a hearing within the next year or two where we can pat these people on the back and say, you've actually done what you said, things are working, there are improvements. Now, I'm a skeptic. I doubt we'll have that hearing, but I certainly hope that we can. And I especially want to commend Congresswoman DeGette. She has been fighting these fights almost as long as I have, and with the same degree of fervor and intensity. And I'm assured that with Dr. Murphy's added vigilance, we might actually get something done. So
thank you. We all share sentiments. Gentleman yields back. Now recognize the gentleman from New Mexico, Mr. Lowen, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Poneman and Ms. Miller, before I ask some questions on Y-12, I want to speak about something that's very important in New Mexico. With the concerns in Washington State where tanks at Hadford are linking radioactive and hazardous waste, I understand that the department is considering sending millions of gallons of highly radioactive waste to New Mexico to be stored at the Waste Isolation Pilot Plant, or WIP. I'd like to get your commitment here today that you will work closely with the New Mexico delegation, state and local officials, and concerned citizens as you explore whether such a transfer will take place and under what conditions.
Congressman, I can assure you, A, that we always take all critical health, safety, environmental issues into account, certainly with respect to the 54 million gallons and their disposition at Hanford, and we will gladly continue to work very closely with this committee and with other members of the Congress to make sure what we do is in full consultation with you.
So, Mr. Poneman, that's a commitment to work with the New Mexico delegation on this issue?
We will work with this committee and with all members of Congress and any affected state.
So I'll interpret that as a yes.
Yes.
I appreciate that, sir. Has there been discussions that have begun with the state of New Mexico on this issue?
I'll defer to Ms. Miller.
The acting Assistant Secretary for Environmental Management, Dave Huizinga, has ongoing discussions with representatives from the state of New Mexico. I recently met with a number of representatives from the state of New Mexico, local representatives, as well as the governor. We did not discuss this issue because this is a pretty new development, as you know. But we are in good, close contact with the delegation, both locally and certainly, as Deputy Secretary Poneman said, very willing to work and look forward to working with you and the other members of the congressional delegation.
I appreciate it, Ms. Miller. I'm one of the representatives as well that represents New Mexico, and so I'd appreciate that very much. I appreciate that. And finally, I hope that this will not happen at the expense of cleaning up existing sites in New Mexico. I don't want to see a slowing down or a decrease in funding and environmental management funding If anything, it should be increased to allow more rapid cleanup, especially in Los Alamos. With the true waste issue in New Mexico, it's ready to be cleaned up and ready to go, and I hope that we can work with you and get a commitment to see what we can do to plus up those accounts. I know sequestration is hitting us, but it's something that's very important to us.
Congressman, sequestration is a huge challenge for all of us. We have legal, contractual, and moral obligations to the state. We take them very, very seriously. I've been there several times myself. We will continue to take that seriously.
I appreciate your commitment, Mr. Poneman. Mr. Poneman, isn't your head of Health, Safety, and Security, or HHS, the person you and the Secretary rely on for developing a coordinating security policy and providing independent oversight and enforcement?
That's true.
And wasn't this a colossal failure as a part of HHS in failing to identify and to correct the specific security weaknesses that were obviously present at Y-12?
Sir, there were a number of failures. There was a January 2009 report from HSS which in fact identified some of the deficiencies which you've heard later described and which in fact facilitated this terrible episode on July 28th. There should have been, as HSS has acknowledged, more rigorous, vigorous, and repeated follow-up from those findings, and they have, in consequence, in terms of lessons learned from this episode, redoubled their commitment under the direction of the Secretary to make sure that they follow up on all such findings in future. So when they do identify a problem, they stick with it until it's resolved.
Well, with that being said, Mr. Poneman, aren't those on the second panel, including reviewers like General Finnan, who are identifying systemic security problems and recommending improvements, doing the job that HHS was supposed to have done?
Well, it's always good after an episode like this to get fresh eyes. And General Finnan, because she had this unique perspective of being in the system but somewhat apart from these specific events, had a unique and invaluable perspective. In fact, her own report recommends that in this three-layer oversight review that the HSS is in fact that third layer of disinterested third-party oversight. We'll hopefully continue to benefit from outside expertise of this character, but also make sure we maintain some independence within the department to assure you don't have conflict of interest in overseeing security.
I appreciate that. And Mr. Poneman, in your earlier comments made before similar hearings, you stated that no federal employees have been terminated as a result of the Y-12 breach, that such terminations are subject to due process. Since there were contract employees that were terminated for a cause, the response seems to suggest that contract employees don't have the same due process protections under the law. Is there any truth to that?
Well, I'm glad you asked the question, Congressman. Let me clarify this. There was accountability on both the federal and the contractor side. On the federal side, and we acted swiftly and effectively to remove anybody who had an involvement in this episode from the chain of command. On the federal side, the top three nuclear security officials in headquarters were removed from those responsibilities. In addition, 3 members at the site from the federal team were either reassigned or removed from their positions. And then on the contractor side, we held accountable by making clear to the contractor that they had lost our confidence. The 3 of the senior people on the protective force subcontract and 3 of the senior people on the M&O contractor. We then folded the subcontract for security under the M&O contract, made it clear we had lost confidence in the contractor, and that contractor was terminated full stop. Now, there are additional actions that can be taken with respect to individuals that are disciplinary in nature. Our first responsibility, as the chairman and ranking member have emphasized, is to protect the material. So the first thing we did is get anybody who had anything to do with this out of the way of possibly protecting material that we now needed to make sure we had new people and new processes to effectuate. Other disciplinary processes have been underway. Some are still continuing, and those are the processes, sir, that I was referring to, where the due process protections applied to these individuals who, like any American, are entitled to due process when it comes to termination.
Thank you, Chairman. And as I yield back, I know time's expired, but I appreciate the concerns and the statements associated with new culture and leadership and changes and what that means coming forward as we look at the future. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Sloan. We let that go on because that was a particularly important answer, too. We thank you for that answer. Now recognize the gentleman from Mississippi, Mr. Harper, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome to each of you on what is a very important topic, not only to you, but to everyone in Congress. And we appreciate the look you're taking at this. And, of course, how do you convey that security is everybody's concern, and always in that situation when you're looking, it seems that it was somebody else's responsibility, so you have to create that culture that everyone is responsible regardless of their position. And do you feel like you're moving things in that direction with NNSA?
Yes, sir, and your comment, I think, ties in well with when the chairman said at the beginning, if you don't measure it, you don't manage it. What we have done since the Y-12 episode is to make sure that in the performance evaluation plans for all contracts, that safety and security is made a constituent part of every programmatic deliverable. So you're not actually performing the job if you do it, but you don't do it safely or you don't do it securely. So that is how we measure and hold people accountable. And so not only are we trying to do this through all the cultural teaching that we're telling you about, but we're trying to build it into the structure of the contracts. That's how we hope to avoid keep coming back, as Ms. DeGette has suggested, by really building it into our system.
And I guess one of the issues would be, how do you make these security changes or improvements? How do you sustain those? You know, I'll go back, DOE did a major, a comprehensive study back in 2008, and it looked like that was great. If those things had perhaps really been sustained, maybe we wouldn't have had the Y-12 incident. So I guess, what confidence should we have, and do you have, that these changes, as a result of this very extensive 90-day evaluation and study, will be sustained?
Congressman, as General Finnan's report makes clear, even if we have put all the structures in place to be successful in a way that we have not succeeded so far, absent leadership, it's not going to succeed. So the first way to sustain it, sir, is by sustained leadership attention, and I can commit to you that that is what we're providing. The second thing I would say is, it is not enough simply to promulgate this and announce it. We have to continue to work with people in the complex, at the sites, and have a continuous flow of information back and forth. And the third thing is, people have to feel comfortable throughout the site, if they actually have concerns, that they may feel free to step forward without any fear of retribution.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, either of the other witnesses have anything that you would care to add? General, anything that you see of how this study, how you believe it would be sustained in the future? It looks great today, and we believe we've done that, but do you see anything else other than what Mr. Podman has added that you believe would show that we could sustain it?
The key is the leadership, just like the Deputy Secretary stated, and a culture. Everyone in the organization has to understand that each and every one of them are a part of security, and that security is a part of the NNSA mission. It's not a support item. It is essential to the mission. So it's culture and leadership.
Okay. Mr. Poneman, the Safety and Security Reform Plan, if I could read this, stated that the Department's contractors maintain an assurance system that provides reliable measurement of the effectiveness of their safety management systems and facilitates timely corrective actions to systems or performance weaknesses. The same direction was given for security systems. The task force found that NNSA relied overwhelmingly upon contractor-provided data rather than effectively reviewing performance itself. Given the broken equipment, security cameras, excessive false alarms at Y-12, clearly the contractor did not correct performance weaknesses in a timely fashion. And I know you've gone over this, but I want to make sure. Do you believe that relying on contractors to provide measurements of their effectiveness is still a sound approach?
I think the system must start, because they have the line management responsibility, with contractor reporting and self-correcting, but it then needs exactly the oversight that General Finnan recommended. Number one, from the nuclear security operation inside NNSA, which is not at the site and therefore is not prone to the coziness that has been a source of some concern. And then secondly, with a third-party independent oversight from the HSS organization.
Do you believe that today would such a breach at Y-12 that occurred on in July of 2012, do you believe that would occur today?
No, sir, I do not. And one thing that we did immediately, the Secretary directed an extent of condition review to be done very quickly to ensure that no similar problems existed at any of the other sites that have Category 1 nuclear material in the complex.
I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Texas is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank our
Gentleman,
panel.
Mr. Green from Texas is recognized.
Different member from Texas. I know there was a contract restructuring in 2007, and I guess what got my attention on Y-12 and also the Pantex site, since that's in North Texas, was that contract restructuring ever completed to have one contractor for both sites?
Yes, sir. We have finished the contract consolidation. There is another piece that is optional with respect to folding the tritium operations at Savannah River in, but that part has not.
Okay. It is. Okay. And I know on a regular occasion at Pantex there's protesters up there, but it's a long way to get there from most urban areas in North Texas. But there has never been any similar incidents like that, like at Y-12 at Pantex, hasn't it?
Not that I'm aware of, sir, and in fact, we were impressed when we looked after the Y-12 incident at, frankly, the contrast, and we brought some expertise from Pantex to Y-12 to help instill some best practices. For example, the practice of repairing cameras very quickly, that was already quite institutionalized at Pantex, and now I'm happy to say all the cameras are fixed, and our average time to repair cameras now at Y-12 is 6.5 hours. So there were some best practices that we ported over from Pantex.
Okay. I worry about impacts on NNSA due to the sequester. Deputy Secretary Poundman, can you talk about the impacts sequestration may have on federal and contractor personnel at NNSA?
Yeah, I will let Acting Administrator Miller offer more detail. But top line is it is a significant effect involving personnel and operations as well. What I can assure you, Congressman, is that the directive from the President is to do everything that we can and must do to protect our core functions. But I will ask Ms. Miller if she's got elaboration.
So I would just add to that. It starts with, of course we will protect the material. Of course we will do things safely. As long as we are allowed to operate, that's exactly how we'll run things. Having said that, I think people have a tendency to look at sequestration in terms of numbers of people who might be furloughed or dollar numbers that might be missing. It is what is a deeper concern at this point is the ongoing disruption to activities that will take projects and programs and make them difficult, if not impossible, to actually execute anywhere near to the plan and to the price and to the need that has already been described. It's that ongoing uncertainty, disruption, and then lack of ability to plan.
Well, and I know that's impacting your agency, but it's also impacting everybody. Have you already notified employees or contractors on they could face personnel actions?
Contractors, their own organizations are responsible for talking directly to their employees because they operate in general off of the money that they are getting for us. We have, of course, worked with them to try to plan and program dollars so that they have some sense of what it's going to look like going forward month by month, and they are making plans and doing notifications accordingly, and I know our contractors have done that. As far as the federal workers are concerned, I sent a note out to our federal workers 2 weeks ago, almost 2 weeks ago, to let them know that we will do everything we can, but I cannot guarantee that it's not going to affect them either.
And I would only add, Congressman, that I have notified all the affected governors, and we will also work with the states in the same vein.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Would the Texan gentleman Texas yield?
Sure.
Mr. Chairman, Ms. Miller, a number of reports observed a culture within NNSA of prioritizing costs, cutting costs above the needs of security. As a follow-up to the question Mr. Barton asked, have M&O contractors throughout the complex been told to cut their security costs?
They certainly have not been told to cut their security costs as any means of a policy, but I would say there's definitely messages that get communicated that when money is tight, people are looking for ways to cut costs, and within an individual organization, a contractor organization, or working with federal people, they may, as General Finnan said, start to make decisions at very low levels on what their interpretation is of the need to cut costs.
So it sounds like they could have been cut. So as a follow-up, have security funding allocations been reduced in recent years before the incident?
security allocations have come down over the last several years. That's right.
Mr. Chairman, I mean, this is a concern I think that we have. Mr. Barn asked a similar question, and hopefully it's something that we can pursue. You know, I'd be interested if security funding's been increased after the incident as well, but I think we'll find that out later. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you. Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Texas, Dr. Burgess, is recognized for 5 minutes.
That sounded like a yes.
Well, on the GAO report that was supplied for this hearing, there's a table, table 1 on page 9 of the report, and you know it's interesting in light of the last question that was just asked about the funding levels. I mean, this is a comparison of a GAO study done in May of 2003, and then the Security Task Force in February 2013. So essentially a decade worth of NSA oversight, and you look at the various things that are listed there, the last one being allocating staff. In 2003, the GAO found NNSA has shortfalls at its site offices in number and expertise of staff, which could make it more difficult for site offices to effectively oversee security activities. Okay, that sounds like a real problem identified by the GAO. So what did General Finnan find 10 years later? The NNSA security function is not properly organized or staffed. Sounds like the same problem to me, stated another way. So, you know, as interesting as this chart is, it really shows that the General Accountability Office's review of the NNSA security organization, when you look at it and go down the list and see the problems with defining clear roles and responsibilities, assessing site security activities, overseeing contractor activities, allocating staff, in each and every case. So, General Finnan, you know, it begs the question. It's almost every problem that was identified 10 years ago you encountered on your task force 10 years later. So, what do you think? Are these longstanding cultural problems that are ingrained in the organization, or are these things that can be corrected?
Clearly, they're long-term cultural basic issues that need to be fixed. And what happens over the years is we looked at each one of those, reports would come out and people would check the box and say, yes, I took care of the findings. What happened was people were nibbling around the edges. You know, they'd put a body or two, okay, you have a shortage, so a body or two would change. But, you know, that would just create a shortage someplace else. They didn't ever stop and take a look at the overall system. How are we going to fix this long term? So by nibbling around the edges, instead of getting at the core issues, they just perpetuated the issues for a decade and probably even longer than that. But every report that we looked at had striking similarities to what we found.
So let me just ask you this as a basic question. How is putting more money into a structurally deficient system, how's it going to make it better? I mean, any amount of money that I agree that, you know, it is reasonable to look at the funding levels, but for crying out loud, we've known about this stuff for 10 years, right, and we haven't fixed it.
And fundamentally, you know, that's why I propose a change in the organization and a change in the assessment model. Now, I think that there are minor increases in budget that might be required, but we're not talking about, you know, hey, let's add $1 billion to the security budget, because the issues that surfaced at Y-12 were structural within the organization and structural within the assessment model. Now, there are other technical aspects of why the Guard didn't respond properly, a whole bunch of things like that are training related and things like that. But when we're talking about the organizational structure, we're talking about some bodies. Yes, there is a shortage of security professionals, so you're talking a small number of additional bodies. And with the assessment model, you're talking about beefing up and changing the assessment model, but you are not talking about a massive influx of dollars.
Well, Chairman Upton, in his opening statement, said we need to learn the right lessons from past mistakes. I mean, I certainly thank you for the effort that you've put into this. I just pray that 10 years from now another Congress is not having another hearing over the same sorts of failures. So, Secretary Poneman, let me ask you, back in 2010, Chairman Emeritus Barton was ranking member, he and I wrote to the Secretary expressing our concerns that the Safety and Security Reform Initiative would weaken outsource by outsourcing safety and security. We requested the General Accountability Office to evaluate. Actually, Chairman Waxman, who was chairman at the time, and Ranking Member DeGette did join in that letter. So given the troubled history of safety and security in the complex and NSA's problems of implementing its own security program, what was the Department of justification for embarking on this project?
It was clear at the time, Congressman, that we needed to focus. And you know the old saying, if you don't know where you're going, any road will take you there. So when I arrived at the department, there were many people saying many different things. We said, let's sit down and figure out what are we doing to be safe? What are we doing to be secure? That was the genesis of that reform. Our management principles say we'll only succeed by continuous improvement. This was part of that process, so we wouldn't just be mindlessly continuing to check the box, but being vigorous and aggressive and saying, how do we be safe? I couldn't agree more with you, Congressman, in your premise that it ain't just throwing dollars at it. It's a deeply cultural thing, and that reform, which I know people have had some concerns about, was intended to be exactly part of the process that you are advocating in terms of a self-vigorous analytical process to get safe and to make people wake up, think, and be active about it.
Well, Mr. Chairman, I've got additional questions. I'll submit those for writing. Thank you for the indulgence, and I'll yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman yields back, and the chair recognizes himself now for 5 minutes. General Finnan, a question to you. In your testimony, you write that the NNSA is structurally inadequate to address security needs. You've made your recommendations. What percentage of those recommendations have either been implemented or on their way to implementation? Just give me a number if you could.
At the time I left the organization, all of the recommendations were in process of being implemented.
Thank you. And additional questions to Ms. Miller, and this question was referenced earlier. The statement that Mr. Don Cook, NNSA Deputy Administrator for Defense Programs, had made earlier, he said, with regard to the relationship that we have and where we are between NNSA and its labs and plants, the statement was made eyes on, hands off. And I think one of the concerns that we have is this isn't just about management. This is about a leadership, a culture of safety and security. And I'm very concerned when it comes to the approach that NNSA, when they talk about eyes on, hands off, that this is actually a management style that is failing to provide the kind of leadership we need in safety and security. Would you agree or disagree with that?
I think what is failing and what has failed is something I spoke a little bit about earlier, and that is it's one thing for people at a very senior level to talk at a very senior level and come out with phrases that they perfectly understand and they may even be able to explain to the 7 or 8 people they talk to all the time about it. But that's a very different thing if you're the person 6, 7, 8 layers down to understand what does that mean for the job you do every day.
And so you can see how that kind of creates a culture, though, that doesn't focus, that focuses more on management and less on leadership of a culture that's truly about safety and security.
I think what happens is it leaves everybody to focus whatever way they can to cope with what they think the person at the top is trying to tell them.
So what are you going to do to make sure that that's different?
So, as you know, right now I'm acting administrator. What we have already begun in NNSA is a change in both the way we talk to staff and our contractors from the lower levels all the way up through the very top levels to be able to allow people to understand how they are meant to do what they do in a safe and secure way. And to understand that safety and security is not the job of the people, not just the job of the people in the uniforms or the guys who can discuss criticality safety in depth. It's everybody's job. It's what you do every day as part of what else you do every day.
Recognizing that it is about the leadership, not just management.
Absolutely.
Okay. General Finnan, in your testimony, you talked about tension between security and the conduct of operations, stating that the events at Y-12 illustrate how far the pendulum has swung too far in the wrong direction, and that NNSA must clearly and consistently emphasize the importance of security. Do you believe the tension between security and operations is inescapable? Or do you think that strong safety and security culture can facilitate improved operations performance given committed leadership?
I absolutely believe that safety and security can make operations better, and depending on how they're integrated, you will have a better operation. But it is a cultural change, and it is a difficult cultural change.
And is the agency right now on the way to that cultural change?
They are trying to make that cultural change. Again, it is a long term. It will take years and constant pressure, constant attention.
Adequate progress in your mind?
They are making early steps. Early steps. It's going to take a long time.
But adequate process, not quite ready to say that?
I'm not quite ready to say that.
Ms. Miller, do you agree with General Finnan that there has been a culture of compromise in NSA?
Yes.
And what are you doing to eliminate that culture?
That's a culture that I think not intentionally but definitely effectively has permeated both the contractor and the federal side of it. And that's a question of leadership making clear what the expectations are for all concerned.
And you believe you've taken the sufficient steps so that your senior managers understand that there must be consistent messaging on security?
I think through a number of actions that have been taken, including the shakeup in management of security, that message has been very clearly communicated as to what is expected of everyone.
And can you tell the committee today, that all of us on the committee, that the head of defense programs, the head of the budget, the federal site managers, your managers, all are now singing from the same hymnal, so to speak?
I can tell you that they know they better be. I can't swear for another person, but I believe it to be the case.
You're not, okay, and have you committed, this information that you're talking about now, you've communicated it, simply supply the committee with memoranda or other communications instituting your policy for emphasizing that security?
Yes.
Thank you. I appreciate your time. And with that, I don't see any other witnesses. So I'll give the gavel back to the chairman.
Thank you.
We are going to dismiss this panel and move on to the next one. I do want to thank you all for your candid and thorough responsiveness. It is extremely important to see leadership being honest with us and help us deal with this. So we look forward to working with you more and talk with you more. And in general, special thanks to you for your report. Good luck over there, and keep that Air Force in line. Thank you, ma'am. We'll wait for the next panel to move
Chairman,
forward.
maybe we can just put her in charge of everything.
There you go.
Whip them into shape.
Well, wait, I'm Navy, so we'll have to discuss that. There you go. Thank you. Well, while this next panel is getting ready, I will start off by introducing them in the interest of saving time as we move forward. We'll have with us Mr. C. Donald Alston, a Major General, United States Air Force, retired, former commander of the 20th Air Force Global Strike Command, and Commander Task Force 214 U.S. Strategic Command, Francis E. Warren Air Force Base in Wyoming. We also have Mr. Richard A. Meserve. Am I pronouncing that right, sir? Meserve, thank you. President of the Carnegie Institution for Science and former chairman of the U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission from 1999 to 2003. We also have Mr. David Trimble, the Director of Natural Resources and Environment Team, Government Accountability Office. Welcome here today. As you know, the testimony you are about to give is subject to Title 18, Section 1001 of the United States Code. When holding an investigative hearing, this committee has a practice of taking testimony under oath. Do you have any objection to testifying under oath? They all have agreed to testify. The chair then advises you that under the rules of the House and rules of the committee, you are entitled to be advised by counsel. Do you desire to be advised by counsel during your testimony today? They will decline counsel. In that case, if you would please rise, raise your right hand, and I will swear you in. Do you swear that the testimony you are about to give is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? I do. Thank you. Note for the record, all the witnesses have answered in the affirmative. We now give a 5-minute summary of your written statement. We'll start with you, Dr. Meserve.
Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member DeGette, and members of the subcommittee, I'm very pleased to appear before you this morning to testify of security at the DOE complex. My involvement with this issue, and I believe General Alston's as well, arose as a result of a request that was made by Secretary Chu that we, as well as Dr. Norm Augustine, undertake an evaluation of basically the structure for the management of security at DOE. We undertook a study that involved visiting sites, reviewing documents, interviewing people, and as a result of all of that effort, we submitted 3 separate letters to the Secretary on December 6 of 2012, and we have submitted copies of those letters for the record as our testimony. We did not purport to investigate the factual circumstances surrounding the Y-12 Institute. Our reports focused on management-related issues. And I hasten to add that our report was a snapshot at time. I was learning a lot about what has happened at DOE since we conducted our interview from the very informative testimony that we've all benefited from earlier this morning. There's a couple of points from my letter that I think I would like to emphasize that I see as clear issues that DOE should confront. I believe that in December 6th, and I believe they are confronting them. One, and I think a critical one, is to make sure you have a management structure in place that assigns clear authority and responsibility for security. One of the underlying factors at the Y-12 incident is there was a division of responsibility and without anyone being truly in charge. And so you had a situation with a contractor responsible for the guards and a different contractor responsible for the security-related equipment and the cameras, and they weren't communicating well, and a lot of the equipment was out of service, and each could point at the other. We also, I also came to the conclusion, and I'll let General Alston speak for himself, that the federal oversight needed to be improved. There was serious security issues that existed before this episode, and no one at DOE that we saw was really on top of detecting them and correcting them. There is issues associated with the protective force, assuring appropriate training. There was an issue associated with the, obviously, the behavior of the first responder. There are many issues associated with the protective force that need to be addressed. You need to find a career trajectory for these people. You need to make sure that they have a sense that they're an important part of the team and they're integrated with the team. I think that all of us came to the view, and this has been emphasized this morning, that one of the things needs to change is the culture, that there has to be a security culture that places both safety and security as the highest priorities, and that management, by its word and deed, reinforces that, and that everyone at the site realizes that it is their individual responsibility to assure security, and that clearly was something that has been failing. And finally, I think what I would add is a need for balance. Clearly, this episode reflected issues associated with physical security, but there are other security issues that confront the department, and one ought to recognize you need a balance, that there are cybersecurity issues, there's personnel security issues, all of which need to be functioning, and one ought not to just, because there was an episode on physical security, focus solely on that. My views are explained more fully in the letter that was submitted as part of the record, and I welcome the opportunity to talk with you this morning.
Thank you. General Alston, I probably should have had you go first. I apologize for confusion, but you're recognized now for your opening statement.
Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member DeGette, members of the subcommittee, I would only briefly amplify what my colleague has so well described as Mr. Augustine's, Dr. Meserve's, and my efforts on behalf of Dr. Chu and the Department of Energy. I would
I would only amplify one particular point, and that would be the culture piece. We've talked this morning, or the first panel engaged you in conversation using some of the expressions that we found to be of concern, eyes on, hands off, for example. And that expression is something that came out of just the last couple of years of policy changes. But as has been reinforced over and over again, the recurring challenges, the similar recurring challenges go beyond the eyes on, hands off policy emphasis that had occurred over the last years. And I think that at the center of the challenge for the department is the cultural change. And one aspect of the cultural change that is that feeds the cultural challenges is the distributed management, the way the department distributes its management across its labs. And the labs prefer and are very successful in their pursuit of the distance between the headquarters and the labs themselves and the freedom of movement that they have. And this has great value, I would concede, on the science piece, but I think that contributes, the security, in fact, needs to have more central management, central emphasis, common standards, and what we find, what I have observed, is that you see people talk about mission, which I read as science. People talk about safety, and there is more of a pervasive safety culture, if you will. But security is not everybody's responsibility. And it's as if mission, safety, and security are in a trade space, where when there's an emphasis on security because of an episodic failure, the other elements of mission and safety see the focus on safety as to be marginally at the expense of the other parts of the mission, as opposed to looking at it as an enterprise challenge, and that in fact they don't share trade space with each other, but in fact are all essential every day to mission success. And with that, I thank the committee for the opportunity to have dialogue this morning.
Thank you very much. Mr. Trimble, you have a chance for an opening statement.
Thank you. Chairman Murphy, Ranking Member DeGette, members of the subcommittee. My testimony today discusses DOE's and NNSA's management of the nuclear security enterprise and will focus on security, safety, and project and contract management. Multiple investigations into the security breach at Y-12 identified significant deficiencies in NSA's security organization, oversight, and culture. In response to the Y-12 security incident and the findings of these reports, DOE and NNSA have taken a number of actions, including repairing security equipment, reassigning key security personnel, and firing the Y-12 Protective Force contractor. More recently, DOE and NNSA's leadership committed to additional actions, such as revamping the security oversight model. We have not evaluated these recent actions, but will examine them as part of our ongoing review on security reform for this committee. A key question underlying this work will be whether DOE's actions to address the security breakdowns at Y-12 will produce sustained improvements in security across the nuclear security enterprise. DOE has a long history of security breakdowns and an equally long history of instituting responses and remedies to fix these problems. In recent testimony, the leader of the NSA Security Task Force examining the Y-12 incident identified problems with NSA's federal security organization, including poorly defined roles and responsibilities for its headquarters and field staff, inadequate oversight and assessments of site security activities, problems ensuring that security improvements are implemented, and failing to ensure adequate staffing. Notably, in 2003, we reported on these same problems which have persisted or resurfaced, notwithstanding numerous DOE initiatives to fix or address them. In examining the security incident at Y-12, it is also important to remember that NNSA security problems have not been limited to Y-12. In March 2009, we reported on numerous and wide-ranging security deficiencies at Livermore, particularly in the ability of Livermore's protective forces to ensure the protection of special nuclear material and the laboratory's protection and control of classified material. We also identified Livermore's physical security systems, such as alarms and sensors, and its security assurance activities as areas needing improvement. Weaknesses in Livermore's contractor self-assessment program and the Livermore site office's oversight of the contractor contributed to these security deficiencies at the laboratory. Los Alamos experienced a number of high-profile security incidents in the 90s that were subject to numerous congressional hearings, including some held by this committee. Subsequently, security evaluations through 2007 identified other persistent systemic security problems, including weaknesses in controlling and protecting classified resources, inadequate controls over special nuclear matter, inadequate self-assessment activities, and weaknesses in the process Los Alamos uses to ensure that it corrects identified security deficiencies. In October 2009, we found weaknesses at Los Alamos in protecting the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of information stored on and transmitted over its classified computer network. Regarding safety, in September 2012, we testified before this subcommittee noting that DOE's recent safety reforms may have actually weakened independent oversight. Notably, since this recent testimony, reports by DOE and the Safety Board have continued to identify safety concerns at Y-12, Pantex, and Los Alamos. Regarding project management, DOE has made progress in managing the cost and schedule of non-major projects, those costing less than $750 million. And in recognition of this progress, GAO has narrowed the focus of our high-risk designation to major contracts and projects. Major projects, however, continue to pose a challenge for DOE and NNSA. December 2012, we reported that the estimated cost to construct the waste treatment and immobilization plant in Hanford, Washington, had tripled to $12.3 billion since its inception in 2000, and the scheduled completion date had slipped nearly a decade to 2019. Moreover, we found that DOE had prematurely rewarded the contractor for resolving technical issues and completing work. We have reported on similar problems with the CMR facility at Los Alamos, the UPF project at Y-12, and the MOX project at Savannah River. In conclusion, over a decade after NNSA was created to address security issues, the Y-12 security incident has raised concern that NNSA has still not embraced security as an essential element of its mission. The numerous actions that DOE and NNSA are taking to address its security problems will require effective implementation across the complex. Without this and strong and sustained leadership, these recent reforms, like past efforts, may not have a lasting impact on the security performance or culture of the agency. Thank you. I'd be pleased to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you. We'll go through these quickly. I want to start off, Dr. Meserve. One of the messages from your work and General Alston's work is the lack of an embedded security culture from DOE headquarters on down through the various nuclear weapons complex facilities. As a former chairman of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, you have experience with embedded safety culture. Am I correct on that?
That's correct.
And the lessons, well, what lessons from your experience in NRC regulation of the civilian nuclear industry can apply to establishing strong security culture at DOE's facilities and operations? Can you give us an example?
Well, let me say that I think that the perspective of the NRC has been that a safety culture is the critical foundation for assuring the safe operation of the plants. That without that commitment, you have a problem in that regardless of how detailed the requirements are, ultimately you have to demand the people fulfill their obligations and take responsibility. And that safety culture, which is something that affects everyone in the plant, is the foundation. So I came to this project with that perspective. And I think that, as has been mentioned, and General Alston emphasized this in his remarks, is that culture is the critical ingredient. And that is something that has to change to have something that will be sustained over time, that people see this as responsible, as their clear responsibility at every level at the facility and in headquarters.
And that sustainment is also sustained training for security personnel, with assuming.
It means sustained training. It means a responsibility of everyone in the plant when they see a problem to raise that issue up. If their immediate supervisor doesn't take it up, it means going above that person. It means having a system in place so that no one faces any discipline or discrimination as a result of the fact that they've raised an issue like that. It's people are to be rewarded if they take initiative to respond. And that's the sort of thing you need in the security area as well.
Thank you. General Alston, you stated in your report that nuclear weapons sites leverage their unique missions and geography to justify a preferred, what you called alone and unafraid mantra, and that DOE and NNSA headquarters has employed a largely hands-off response. What do you mean by alone and unafraid?
Mr. Chairman, at Y12 specifically, earlier in the year, earlier in calendar year 2012, the site security apparatus had upgraded their security system, and there was a multi-$100 million option, and this was still a very expensive option of, I can't remember, $60 to $70 million. And so they went forward with this $60 to $70 million modification to their overall security capability at the site. But when they deployed that capability early in the year, it had flaws that needed to be worked out, and that was widely known. But they operated it anyway, generated hundreds of alarms, false alarms or nuisance alarms a month, conditioned the force, I would argue, to not respond with urgency because they were being conditioned that the alarms are systemic shortcomings. There was they moved towards the accounting for the alarms and less running to the sounds of the guns, which I think was manifest on the morning of July 28th because of the delayed response, because it was another false or nuisance alarm, if you will. And that whole effort, though, was, from my perspective, was Y12 saw a way to improve its security, and in my view, I saw evidence they conceived, designed, developed, and deployed this capability at Y12, defending their unique geographical challenges to secure that facility, and making their, if you will, one-off approach to this to be dominant between the relationship between Y12 and the headquarters. And so there's not evidence of a strong, disciplined, central management of security modifications so that the field can soup to nuts take a look at at what they determine to be shortcomings and then work the solution set on their own without what I think is more appropriate, a good operational test evaluation program where someone's accountable in the headquarters for the next gate you go, and that nobody lives with a sub-optimized system that is not operating perfectly on day one.
Is this systemic across NNSA?
Well, we found a different approach at Pantex. Everyone is trying to, and I can't tell you the current state of this, and maybe Dr. Meserve could amplify this, but the Argus system, and I can't tell you what the acronym stands for, but it's a comprehensive security approach that is present at all of their sites. But depending on how you manipulate part of the overall Argus architecture at your particular site, they may not be precisely identical at each one of the facilities. So as these folks were trying to integrate the changes to their security apparatus and blend into this Argus concept, there is so much freedom of movement at each one of the sites that I think there's great opportunity being missed trying to centralize common standards and force a common approach and making the sites defend being different than the common approach, as opposed to right now, which is give them the benefit of the doubt that they need to support the one-off approach and that the common standards get subordinated to the unique approach. I don't know if I said that
well. No, that helps a lot. But as this goes through, I cannot help, as I'm hearing these stories about security issues too, of when the people watching the radar on Pearl Harbor on December 7th said, "Oh, pay no attention to those blips. That's just probably our planes coming over," or on 9/11, these things continue on, and hope that the security force is not going to just look past these things. I mean, recognize in a situation like this, as Mr. Meserve, you put in your letter, that sometimes training of terrorists is to look non-threatening, and yet you have to be ready for deadly force. And this could have ended up in a deadly situation, and we're hoping these things are avoided in the future. I'm out of time. I'm going to go to Ms. DeGette now from Colorado.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Trimble, when you were reciting the whole litany of problems that we've had with the various labs, it was like I was reliving my congressional career. And so I want to ask you, have you read General Finnan's report?
Yes, I have.
And what's your opinion of her recommendations?
You know, all the recommendations sound sound. We've not done a full evaluation or anything of that nature. I think our reaction to this, the reports as well as the actions DOE has already taken is sort of the proof's in the pudding. So
yeah, so you think it's a good direction, but you want to make sure it gets implemented.
Yeah, and I think even more than that, it would be where's the implementation plan?
Right.
So we've got a lot of, okay, we're going to do this, we're going to do that, but
Let's
where's the DOE summary of all of these efforts saying, hey, this is our assessment of all this good work these people have done, and here is our plan with metrics and dates and who's accountable going forward.
Okay. And General, have you read General Finnan's report?
No, ma'am, I have not.
Okay.
Her report was in draft while we were essentially commissioned by Secretary
Are you familiar with her recommendations?
I am familiar with a lot of them. I couldn't recite them for you.
I'm not asking you to. Good news, I only have 5 minutes. So my question, though, is do you think she's going in the right direction with her recommendations based on your assessments?
I do. Where I was encouraged particularly by her approach was trying to certainly recognize the field shortcomings, but the headquarters chain needs to be fixed, and
it needs to be clarified, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. And what about you, Dr. Meserve?
My response.
Okay. Now, every few years, I alluded to this in my previous questioning. Every few years, some in Congress suggest that NNSA should be autonomous from oversight. Last year, the House passed a National Defense Authorization Act that included a provision providing additional autonomy from oversight by this committee, for example, for NNSA. Luckily, this language was not in the final law, and part of our job is to make sure that we have adequate oversight, so we're glad that it wasn't in the final law. I think, and all of us on this committee think, the Y-12 security breach shows that the NNSA is simply not ready for that level of autonomy that the National Defense Authorization Act contemplated. So, General, I want to ask you and Mr. Meserve, were any of the issues you identified caused by a lack of autonomy for contractors and those who worked for Y-12? Were they caused by a lack of autonomy?
I would say that the consequence of the relationship between the semi-autonomous nature of NNSA and the Department of Energy did cause a conflict in ambiguity for policy. And so the NNSA was dependent upon the Department of Energy apparatus for independent inspection by HSS and the Inspector General, properly so.
So what you're saying is that the autonomy that they had actually caused some of the problems.
That they didn't have sufficient autonomy for them to be exclusively accountable for the failure.
Okay. And that was because they were partially reporting to DOE?
Because the field would look up the chain of command, and there were limits to what how beholden they were to the NNSA, because certain policy elements were the purview and domain of organizations in the headquarters that were outside the department.
So it was because they were it wasn't fish or fowl. They were semi-autonomous, right?
Yes, ma'am. And Dr. Meserve may have a better way to say this from our perspective.
Dr. Meserve?
I think that part of the problem was this not the autonomy of NNSA, but the fact that there's a very confusing structure. Something was simplified and had clear lines of authority and responsibility is what's necessary.
Right.
That could be done with an autonomous NNSA. It could be done with the current structure, but having clear guidelines as who's
the problem wasn't. Yeah, I got you. The problem wasn't whether it was autonomous or not. The problem was there wasn't a chain of command. Yes. I want to ask you very quickly, Mr. Trimble. Do you think that does the GAO believe that NNSA's issues can be solved through a simple structural change?
We've previously testified that we do not. We think the issues that need to be addressed can be done with the current structure, and again, it's a cultural change, a sustained effort.
Thank you.
The gentleman yields back. Now recognize the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Johnston, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and gentlemen, thank you for being with us today. Dr. Meserve, if the Department of Energy office responsible for independent oversight is subjected to political retaliation for conducting that oversight, how would that impact their ability to remain objective and independent in your view?
Well, I mean, the obvious danger is that if they're being criticized for doing their job, that they will then back off doing what they're supposed to be doing. And so I think that that would be unfortunate, that if they didn't have a clear view of what their obligations were and their mission is.
Okay. General Alston, what is your view of the importance of independent oversight?
I think that it is appropriately integrated in a mosaic of sensors and indicators to tell you how sturdy your readiness, or in this case, the quality of the security. I think that if you move too much towards depending on independent inspection and evaluation, you're missing great opportunity to have to defend yourself against crisis. You're focused on defending against crisis and ultimate failure, but you're not taking advantage of building routine relationships and seeing whether or not your organization has the capacity to recognize failure when the conditions begin to present themselves. If you need someone outside to tell you how ready you are, you may not have the skill yourself to know yourself. So I believe it needs to be a mosaic of inputs that are converging at the right level to give the leadership at the local, intermediate, and the higher levels the competency to and the confidence in just what the quality of the performance of the unit is.
I couldn't agree with you more, and it's analogous to I know in my 26-and-a-half-year career in the Air Force, you have your unit mission, you have standards and evaluation who are the internal looks, eyes and ears to make sure that you are following those rules, but you also have the Inspector General. Right. Who takes a look from the outside, and both are very, very important. Back to the issue though of political retaliation, to both of you, what impact would political retaliation have on safety and security, the culture of safety and security? You mentioned, Dr. Meserve, that people would just stop.
Well, you need to have a system that reinforces the priority that's to be given to safety and security, and that anything that interferes with the capacity for people to have a willingness to confront those issues honestly and to address them thoroughly is a detriment to achievement of safety and security.
Sure.
And that could be through political process, through fear of retaliation by a superior. There's any number of things that could affect it. But the point here is to keep your eye on the ball, and that anything that distracts you from that is a negative factor.
Sure.
And I couldn't agree more with General Alston, is that one ought not to anticipate that you're counting on the oversight function as your primary means to prevent shortfalls. That responsibility has to be in the line organization that is responsibility for the job, and they should be held accountable for it. The oversight is a protective mechanism to make sure that they're fulfilling their function adequately and appropriately.
Absolutely.
And sir, I would add just one point, and that is, if you don't have at a grassroots level the kind of environment where the folks will come forward to expose weakness and challenge, you are not going to get to the self-critical culture, the level of self-critical culture that you really need in this business where the stakes are so high.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. General, given the site's, I quote, alone and unafraid posture, how important, in your opinion, are standardization, benchmarking, and best practices to achieving and sustaining high security levels?
Sir, clearly they feed every day when you can, on a routine level, have the lines of communication sufficiently open where there's collaborative process and standards don't have to be issued from above. There can be collaboration. It builds trust. It builds flow of information up and down the chain. Myself and Mr. Augustine came to the conclusion that the federalization of the protective force should be given serious consideration. And the reason, I'm a unity of command guy, and that creates a seam with the operator who is enriching uranium or whatever the other part of the mission would be. And so it's a little odd for me to have come down on this side, but for precisely the reasons of standardization and more centralized control and impact, that I felt that would be one means by which that could be achieved.
Well, thank you. Mr. Chairman, I actually do have one more question, if it would please the chair that I could ask it. Otherwise, I'll yield back.
We'll give you an additional minute.
Okay. General Alston, one final question. General Finnan's task force noted a distinct bias against finding and stating performance criticisms. You stated your belief that one of the attributes of a security organization is, and I quote, an absolute intolerance for shortfalls, deficiencies, outages 1 minute longer than necessary. What must happen for NNSA to transition from General Finnan's assessment to the attribute that you described?
I played an active role as the Air Force was recovering from its epic failures. I was required to produce a roadmap, and there were a lot. Obviously, we were on fire, and there were a lot of activities that had to go on there. But one of the things that we instituted was to find structural mechanisms to prove leadership commitment. And so the Chief and Secretary created a nuclear oversight board that met quarterly. And it was a forum where everyone with nuclear equities at the senior level would meet. But it was a forum where you could expose whatever level of detail that you wanted to expose. And in the case of the failure we saw at Y-12, it wouldn't require so much the senior levels of NNSA, but there needs to be a process where the connection is reinforced so that you're tracking outages to the right level, and for example, or equipment shortages, and that there is a recurring forum so that routine interaction can fortify commitment to the security part of the enterprise.
Thank you, General. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
All right, now recognize the gentleman from New York, Mr. Tomko, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The obvious major part of NNSA's work is security, but equally important is providing their employees with a safe working environment. The consequences of safety failures are serious, and for example, in October of 2007, GAO reported that nearly 60 serious accidents or near misses had occurred at NNSA's national labs since 2000. Just to give one example, GAO described a 2004 accident where a student working at the NNSA facility at Los Alamos was blinded in a laser accident. Mr. Tremble, you had indicated in your testimony that GAO has been conducting assessments of safety at NNSA for quite some time. And while I heard some of the results being mentioned here, I'd like to know more importantly how the agency is faring. Are they getting better at addressing safety concerns?
I would like to say yes, but as of now, I can't say that our work has shown that. I think one of the things that's relevant to the discussion today that ties into the safety and security reform initiatives from 2010 is we've previously reported that those initiatives did not address our concerns previously expressed regarding the safety culture at NNSA, and specifically we noted that some of those reforms we've viewed weakened federal independent oversight by making HSS's role sort of more of a mother may I in terms of being able to come in and inspect facilities. And then I think in our testimony as well, we note since our last testimony on these matters in the fall, there have been numerous other safety incidents that have been reported. So our concerns in this area continue.
Thank you. You also made mention, I'll quote, that they have not demonstrated sustained improvements in terms of their safety reforms. Can you tell us about NNSA's recent efforts to reform those measures in terms of safety protocols?
I don't know about protocols per se. I think the 2010 safety initiative, the reform initiative, did a lot to consolidate. There's a lot of good in there in terms of consolidating and rationalizing directives, et cetera. Again, as I noted, that we saw problems with it. But as with security, the issue is one of sustainment. You go through these same periods of an accident happens, it gets attention, you have remedial measures, and then attention wanes, and then you go through the same cycle once again.
So then what should the agency do or be doing to promote or improve worker safety?
Well, I think, again, it's a continued and sustained effort in addressing sort of cultural issues that have crept in. I think you see, just as in security, where you have the divide between headquarters and the field units, there's a divide there in terms of the importance and differing perceptions, perhaps, of the level of importance this sort of mission holds.
And in terms of any oversight protections?
In terms of oversight, well, independent, clearly we've been on the record in terms of having robust independent oversight, much like in the security realm. So bolstering the role of HSS in that regard, I think, is essential.
Okay. I'll yield back, Mr. Chair.
I thank the gentleman, and I want to say that for all the panelists, I thank you today, both panels. I also want to note that certainly at times like this when we have hearings about security issues, security breaches, there are those who watch to see where our weaknesses are. They certainly take note of the comments made, and we recognize a lot of the things that are being done for security remain certainly classified at many levels. But in a situation like this, I think it gives the ranking member and I and the members of both sides of the aisle confidence to know that actions are being taken. Because in a world where terrorists on any level may take action against our interests at sites such as this or other ones, that our nation will be strong and stand up and prevent problems in the future with this. And so we thank you for your comments and good Americans to help us with that security. I ask unanimous consent that the contents of the document binder and all the majority memos be introduced into the record and to authorize staff to make any appropriate redactions. Without objection, the documents will be entered into the record with any redactions the staff determines is appropriate. And in conclusion, again, thank you all the witnesses. I remind members they have 10 business days to submit questions to the record, and I ask that all the witnesses agree to respond promptly to the questions. This committee is now adjourned. Thank you.